I think this is a really exciting session to be in, and I think you're going to find out why if you're able to stay for all the talks. What I'm going to be doing is to just give you an idea that what we know now about soil biodiversity, we didn't know 20 years ago. And it is an exciting period because we know so much about what soil biodiversity does for us. And in fact, we think that soil sustains the biodiversity we see. It's incredibly important. And in fact, that for all of the sustainability development goals that we're talking about, many more than what you see, all of them are connected to soil, even when we're talking about marine, because some of the soil blows into there's an interchange between the soil in the oceans and the lakes. If you remember, 2015 was the International Year of Soils. And in fact, what I want you to remember for this year is that 2016 is going to be the year of soil biodiversity. And I'm going to try and show you why and how we've advanced. This hasn't always been so. If you may remember, or let me just point out, that in terms of soil formation back in 1941, and we knew it before that we knew the factors that formed soil. And one of those was potential biota. One of the soil forming factors was potential biota. And in fact, Hans Jenny said in 1941 that biota were important to determine the rate at which the chemical and biological transformations proceeded. And I think this is where the disciplines started splitting somewhat, because it is very difficult to look at soil biodiversity, especially when you consider how much soil biodiversity there is, the weight of it in a field. This is sheep compared to soil biodiversity. And then if you look at how many million organisms you could hold in your hand and how many taxa, we can understand why in many carbon models, in many considerations of how to manage soils, it just became a black box of unknown things, and we assumed everything was the same. What we know now is that soil habitats are very dynamic, and these living interfaces are key regulators of a lot of ecosystem processes and provide benefits. And so they're an integral part of soil. They're not separate for it. So 40 years later, even more than that, we now know a lot about soil biodiversity, and yet soil biodiversity is left out of science and policy agendas. Here we see a lot of the policy agendas that are going on being discussed here, and we now know that these are interactive. It's not just one that we're studying climate change, it's climate change across diseases, human, animal, plant diseases. Soil organisms have to do with that, with food security, certainly, soil fertility. But yet we don't see soil biodiversity in these per se. We also have a new initiative called Future Earth that's research for sustainability, and we hope that soil biodiversity will be part of that. And in fact, when you look at how much we know globally, you go across many different, and we could have put all sorts of maps here: soil type, soil organic carbon, land degradation, climate. We ask why there isn't a map for soil biodiversity. Well, today we're going to tell you that there is. We're going to tell you what it does and why it's so exciting right now to be studying these organisms below ground. We started about 5 years ago, the Global Soil Biodiversity Initiative. A group of scientists got together, typical fashion, and said, we know a lot, but we're not telling people about what we know. And in fact, in the last 20 years, there's been such a revolution in our understanding of soil biodiversity that we know so much more that we want to translate this. We now have at least 850 participants around the world, scientists and others who are contributing. And so we can take the Global Soil Biodiversity Initiative and hopefully use that knowledge for solutions, or at least options, for many of the things that we're looking at, many of the changes that we're seeing on our globe. So what I want to do is just talk briefly about, give you some ideas and examples of the accelerating scientific knowledge and what's happened in the last 20 years, some of the threats to soil biodiversity, and then what it does for us. Why do we care? This is an example from 1988 to present of just the citations on the Web of Science for the terms soil biodiversity and ecosystem processes, ecosystem function, ecosystem service. And we're not saying that everything ties. You can see in land degradation it's fairly considered, nutrient cycling, but you can see that there's been an increase in the term soil biodiversity. Another thing that's happened in the last 20 years, and these are just examples, you don't have to remember these are examples of many cross within nation or across nation types of experiments or exploratories to look at soil biodiversity. So there's been a real push globally in many countries to look at soil biodiversity, and these are all collaborative, interdisciplinary. It's no longer one taxa or looking at one field. It's a consideration much larger than that. The other thing that's happened is that all these organisms we're considering now more integrated in terms of food webs even. So there's an accelerating quantification to know, is every soil sample the same in terms of its biodiversity? And the answer is no, it's not. The same organisms are not necessarily in every soil you look at. We tie it much more to soil habitats. What does the habitat tell you? Here's a paper of North and South America sampling that shows across different types of biomes, grasslands, temperate forest, dry forest, shrubland, that soil bacteria diversity is determined by pH. Here's an example of 3 labs. I was one of these labs, and we got together and said, okay, let's really show what we can learn. This is Central Park in July in the northern hemisphere. It was very hot. We took 600 soil samples in one day. We took the soil, we had the soil chemical and physical properties analyzed, and we did total soil biodiversity for each one of these soil cores from 0 to 10 centimeter depth and published a paper. We can now, in a soil core with molecular methods, which is the newest advantage in the last 20 years, determine who's there and where they are. What good is the information if you can't put it towards a map? Here is bacteria and eukaryotes, the fungi, the protists, the animals, put into a map of the UK for soil carbon, and then to see what kind of land use. How do they spread out across land use? Again, they're not all in the same place. They're different communities of organisms under each step, each soil type we look at. So this is great, but what do they do for us? This is one of the reasons soil biodiversity has been in a black box for a number of years. Well, here is some evidence that shows that all the decomposition studies that people have done, I think this is 129, just a meta-analysis showing that soil fauna are really crucial to that litter decay, and that's not just earthworms or termites. These are even down to the smaller mesofauna, the mites and the nematodes are key to litter decomposition. And of course, we know about soil stabilization and infiltration and what happens when we don't have earthworms. We lose some of this infiltration ability. And the relationship of soil fertility to above ground biomass is really critical, and knowing what the soil biodiversity is to help promote that. We also know a lot about the ones that link above ground and depend on the below ground. Bees, for example, these honeybees, solitary bees, bumblebees have soil phase in their life cycle. And we also know that in terms of health for humans and animals, we have soil transmitted health ailments that we don't have a map of. We have plant pathogens that we don't have a map of, but we're getting there. So what are the threats? There are numerous papers, and I just wanted to give you a couple of examples here. Here's intensive agriculture. This was a 2014 paper showing soil biodiversity decreases. And I should say here that this is looking at not just one group, but everything from protozoa on. Extinction of soil biota. We know that here in Brazil, we can see the diversity when you go from native vegetation to sugarcane of the macrofauna with land management. We know also that the abundance, when the abundance of an organism like dung beetles decreases, we see a proportional decrease in the amount of dung removed. Or here, when the nematodes decline, we see a change in the carbon cycling, the CO2. So we have numerous examples of declining diversity or abundance with different types of threats to soil. Just as we call them threats to soil, they're also impacting the soil biodiversity that live there. Now is the exciting part, because this is the Global Soil Biodiversity Atlas, and we've been able, and Arwen is going to talk a little bit more about this, we now have threats. We have a map, an approximation of what are the threats worldwide to soil biodiversity. So just a little bit about management of soil biodiversity, because Jeff is going to talk about this in more detail. We have for a long time considered management by only thinking about what we see. It is time to consider this as a whole system, and it's not just the soil physical and chemical characteristics, it's the life within the soil that we also need to manage for maximum ecosystem services. This particular paper is really one that you ought to look at. It's classic. It's across different management types in Europe. De Vries et al. Said in the end of it, and this is for all organisms, and they looked at new molecular techniques, they looked at old morphological techniques, they quantify the contribution of all groups of soil fauna, the microbes to the animals, to look at carbon and nitrogen cycling, nitrification, all the processes, and said that soil biota need to be included in carbon and nitrogen cycling models, and this highlights the need to map and conserve soil biodiversity across the world. That is why we want to do the atlas, because the data, this example is just one of many that are showing the importance of soil biodiversity, and that we need to understand how to manage that soil biodiversity as we're managing soils. So here is the atlas. You're going to hear more about that. This was the first meeting of the editorial board when we didn't know what we were getting into. So I hope you get a chance to look at the atlas. Within this atlas, it talks about management. What can we do to protect soil biodiversity and the different types of management schemes? There's papers on this, or pages on this. So we go back to soil biodiversity, soils, and sustainability. When I look at the goals, the Sustainability Development Goals, every one of them, whether you're talking about poverty, whether you're talking about clean water, whether you're talking about health of the air or carbon in the air, these goals are challenging, but they involve soils and the living soils. I see them this way: food for wildlife. That's what the soil organisms are. Food for plants and animals, and for us, food security. You can go down. The regulation of the pathogens in soils is done naturally. We know very little about that, and the disciplines are very spread out in terms of how we study them, and can be brought back together by people thinking about the soil organisms and what they do to regulate each other or the pathogens. This is the point of the Global Soil Biodiversity Initiative Network. We have great plans. We would take your ideas, and I just hope that as you look at these different types of organisms, that you will remember that no longer is soil biodiversity a black box. We are cracking into that, and we're moving fast on it. Think about this statement of Aldo Leopold, that taming flora and fauna without considering the fact that it's wild flora and fauna, which built the soil to begin with, may likewise be important to its maintenance. And note that this was also in 1941. It has taken a long time for us to get there, but with the new molecular techniques, with the new global information systems that we have, putting soil, the habitat, and the organisms with it is going to be key to sustainability. Thank you.